Gallery view. Okay. So here we go. We are beginning session 2 of the Joshua overview. We had a week off, and I'm excited to be back on target here because this has been really actually a very fun study to prepare. Learned a lot of very interesting things about this book that I've never really learned before, and a lot of interesting Midrash that we're going to look at tonight. Tonight's going to be very exciting. We're not going to get past, even though this is an overview, I did, introduction in chapter 1 last time. This is going to be, we're going to get into chapter 3, but we're not going to fly through this early part of the book. The early part of the book is some of the most interesting parts of Joshua. So with that, without further ado, let's go ahead and step into it. I want to review a few concepts that we talked about last week. 2 weeks ago. We already covered chapter 1, but we're going to go back and cover some things that I didn't talk about. Hey, Kevin, you made it. You got the link. Sorry I got there late.
Not a problem.
No, I came on and I'm like, oh shoot, I never gave Kevin the link, so I scrambled and got it and sent it off to you. So I'm glad you got it. So anyways, good to have you on tonight. We're going to have a small group tonight. A lot of people that are normally here have commitments tonight, so we'll just have fun, just us. So I was just saying that I'm going to go back over chapter 1 and a few points that I didn't talk about last time to cover some stuff that I think is important. Because in this overview, we're not going to go verse by verse through the whole book, but we are going to cover some key points. And especially one of the things I'm focusing on is, I'm going to ask you guys to mute yourselves if you're not muted. There's a lot of stuff in the Midrash on Joshua that I've just been floored learning how much of this is an overlay. There's different ways of looking at this. A lot of people will look at stuff like this and they'll say, oh, well, gee, these parallels just prove the ministry of Jesus. But there's another way to look at it. I think that the writers of the New Testament actually plucked from some of these stories to use as messianic parallels to try to illustrate and support their narrative about Jesus. And I think you're going to see what I'm talking about as we go forward with this, because you can look at it as a positive affirmation or you can look at it cynically. There's two different ways to look at it. That's why I introduced last class. I said, you guys be the judge. You guys be the judge on this. I have my suspicions that a lot of the things that we read about in the New Testament are actually stories that are plucked from Jewish tradition about other great tzaddiks of Jewish history. And they're compiled and put together as a presentation, as a way of convincing their audience of the greatness of this guy. That's my opinion. I think it's a valid opinion. I think some of these things are just too rich to ignore those parallels. Somebody who's less prone to doubt would be like, well, no, this just goes to prove that he fulfilled. But you can't fulfill a midrash. That's the thing I'm trying to say is you don't fulfill a midrash. It's not like somebody, oh, he fulfilled this midrash. A midrash is not a prophecy. It's a teaching. So when I see these midrashic teachings and I see them being almost exactly parallels to some of the quote-unquote miracles that were done, it makes me think that that something's going on. So you guys can be the judge on your own, but I just find this fascinating. And we're going to see some of this tonight with Joshua, which I didn't realize how much of this is in Joshua that's like that. But beyond all that, we're also going to learn some very important Jewish teachings on this book. As I mentioned last time, this is a very, very important book in Jewish lore. Without rehashing everything, last time we talked about how in Jewish teaching it says that if it wasn't for the sin of the golden calf, that all that would have been needed was the Torah of Moses and the book of Joshua. So Joshua 1:1 says, now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister. So believe it or not, I'm actually going to quote from a Christian commentary called Clark's Commentary, which he said something here that I thought was important. In his words, he says, and this is an old commentary from like the 19th century. It says, even the first words of this book show it to be a continuation of the preceding and intimately connected with the last chapter in Deuteronomy. And I had something I wanted to read related to that from the Talmud. So if we turn to the Talmud, I turn to Bava Batra 15a. And the Talmud says this. It says, the Gemara elaborates on the particulars of this Bereda. The master said above that Joshua wrote his own book and 8 verses of the Torah. The Gemara comments, the Bereda is taught in accordance with the one who says that it was Joshua who wrote the last 8 verses in the Torah. This point is subject to a Tanaitic dispute, as it is taught in another Bereda, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there, Deuteronomy 34:5. Is it possible that after Moses died, he himself wrote, and Moses died there? Meaning Moses couldn't have written that. Rather, Moses wrote the entire Torah up until this point, and Joshua wrote from this point forward. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, and some say that Rabbi Nehema stated this opinion. So what we have there very simply is confirmation that, much like I thought about as I studied this, I thought about the Lord of the Rings. You know, when you have the Lord of the Rings story, and you have at one point Samwise Gamgee becomes a ring bearer, right? He has that brief period where they're on the steps of Mordor, where Frodo loses consciousness and he gets, spun into a bunch of spider goop by the big giant spider, and Sam rescues the ring, and he actually carries the ring, and he goes and he uses it to rescue Frodo. And it's an interesting point of contact, because technically speaking, Sam is actually a ring bearer. And in the same sense, we have Moses writing the Torah, but in this one little small section, it was necessary for there to actually be another additional author of the Torah, and that's Joshua. So I thought that was worth noting. And then, of course, in Joshua 1:7, it says, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses, my servant, commanded thee. So Kevin says, what about Joshua being a shadow image of Mashiach? Even King Solomon said there is nothing new under the sun. Yeah, well, that's one of the things that we talked about last time, was that Joshua was a messianic figure. Now, I got in some trouble this past week because somebody who was in Chabad saw my Joshua teaching, and they saw that I said that Joshua was a messianic figure. And of course, many people don't know how to differentiate terminology. Now, the term messianic, because of the Hebrew roots movement and the messianic Jewish movements, the term messianic has become associated with, Christians practicing Jewish things, trying to do Torah in a Yeshua-centered way, whatever they say about it. All the different terminology. But unfortunately, that's really kind of new. That's really a new morphing of that term. Traditionally, the term messianic is a Jewish term, and it's a Hasidic Jewish term. So all Hasidic Jews, by definition, are messianic, but they're not messianic in the way that, a messianic synagogue is messianic. They're messianic in the sense that they have an expectation of Mashiach. So I thought it was humorous that I got accused this past week of, well, you're teaching messianic teachings. I'm like, well, so is Chabad. No, they're not. I'm like, yes, they are. Every Chabad shul is messianic by definition. That's how I mean it when I say that. When I say Joshua is a messianic figure, I'm saying that he's a messianic figure in the Jewish sense of the word. I'm not saying that he's a messianic figure as a parallel of Jesus. I'm saying that he's messianic in truth, according to a Jewish conception and definition. The Messiah is a leader who conquers. He overcomes. So Joshua does. Moses is the same way. He's a messianic leader. Bar Kokhba was a messianic figure. The Maccabees were messianic. This is the concept of messianism in Judaism, is the idea of a zeal, a prophetic zeal of a great one rising up and leading the people to victory. That's what it is. Unfortunately, like I said, when we throw the term messianic around nowadays, people think that you're talking about something else. And many times people are. So, but in my case, that's not what I'm doing. So again, going back to Clark's commentary, just because I like the way he worded this, it says, is it not strange that at the death of Moses, utter despair had not overwhelmed the entire camp, as he who they expected to give them rest had died before any conquest was made in Canaan. We find, however, that they are not discouraged. He who gave them Moses has now given them Joshua in his place. From all this, we may learn that when God has a great work to accomplish, he will provide himself suitable instruments, and though one, if I'm reading that right, and though one who he has greatly honored appear to fail, we should know that he is not confined to work by that one alone. I thought that was a really important comment. I'm going to probably use it in a way that Adam Clark didn't mean it to be used, but nonetheless, I'm going to use it anyways. So what he's saying here basically is that he's making the observation that even though Moses, the leader, died without taking them into the land, the people had been prepared to receive a changing of the guard. Apparently the people knew in advance that Moses was going to die and that Joshua was going to take over. There was a succession plan in place already. And I think this is a really, really subtle but important point to make, that when your faith is based on a single individual, then if he fails, you fail. But if your faith is based on a collective revelation that's given to a people, then the expectation is that if one leader falters, another will take his place, if that makes sense to you. Even in the testimony of the early disciples of Jesus, according to church history, we have the same pattern. We have stories, although we don't see it in the actual text of the Bible, we do see in church sources and confirmed through the early church fathers that the tradition was that Jesus definitely told his followers that they were to go to James, the just, to find their leadership and their direction in his absence. So Jesus prepared them for that by installing James in advance. Now that's disputed. There are some reports that would say, well, no, James was elected at one point. But there are some traditions that say that, no, he was appointed directly before the death of the leader. So again, this is a Jewish idea. And it has different manifestations to it. In the Chabad movement, of course, you have the founder of the Chabad movement is the Alter Rebbe, who was interestingly, he was good friends with Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. They were friends and they were supporting one another. And then, of course, you have a succession. So you've got a generational succession of leadership that comes after that. So you go from the Alter Rebbe all the way up to the Lubavitcher Rebbe Schneerson, who was the last great Rebbe of the Lubavitcher tradition. And so you have a succession. You have a succession of leadership and a carrying on of the tradition. You have the same thing in the Breslov movement. You've got Rebbe Nachman, and then you've got a series of disciples that carry on the teachings generation to generation. This is a very Jewish thing. And I think it's interesting that Clark points this out, that here they are about to enter into their promise, and they lose Moses, the great Moses, the greatest prophet of Israel's history, and yet the people are not discouraged, because Moses has successfully, at this point, transferred the faith that they did have in him to God. Of course, we realize that was really the faltering of the people with the sin of the golden calf, was Moses was just simply gone too long. And the people lost their nerve. They wanted to replace him. But now somehow they've learned their lesson, and they've recognized now that, Moses is going away, but we have someone else. We don't have to despair. And that's what Clark points out. And what we learn from it, as he observes, is that when our faith is in Hashem, then we don't get discouraged when one is taken away. And that's really where our faith should be. Our faith should be in Hashem. Our faith should be in Hashem as God, and our faith should be in Hashem as King. And people come and go, and great men and women come and go, and they leave a mark behind, but they are ultimately only instruments in Hashem's hand. There is only one God. So that leaves you with the idea, a key that I wanted to emphasize, that when we talk about the concept of a tzaddik, we're not talking about a magic. We're not talking about a magical thing. We're talking about the idea of the teachings. It's the teachings of the tzaddik that are the key. If not for the tzaddik's teachings, there's nothing to cling to. Again, this is one of the big problems with Christianity. Is Christianity, in many people's understanding, is a cult of human sacrifice. The belief in Jesus is based upon a sacrificial atonement. Very few Christians today are actually intimately familiar with the teachings of Jesus. They're intimately familiar with the story of his death, and they're familiar with the teachings of Paul. Christianity is largely based upon the teachings of Paul, who mysticizes the death and resurrection of Jesus. But it's the teachings that are the key when it comes to our connection to a tzaddik. When you study the teachings of a tzaddik, you're studying their connection to God. And through their connection to God, you are now connecting as well in an elevated sense by virtue of your connection to the tzaddik. Therefore, in that framework, the tzaddik doesn't take the place of God. He doesn't become an intermediary that stands between you and God. He becomes like a video game. If you have a video game character and you collect a boost, and you enact the boost, and you're able to go super fast and do all kinds of crazy things while you've got the booster enacted, then the booster wears off and you're back to your normal self. It's a crude example, maybe a poor one, but basically your attachment to the tzaddik is like having a booster. He boosts and elevates your connection because the teachings are directly connected to the higher levels of spirituality. That's really the thing we have to see there. That's really the tzaddik's function. The tzaddik doesn't serve the function of being a sacrificial atonement. The atonement comes in other ways. So a tzaddik and the teachings of the tzaddik are a fit vessel for truth for his generation, primarily, and then they transcend it. So the tzaddik, a true tzaddik, will provide atonement for his generation, for those who attach to him, and he will provide guidance and light for those who come after his generation. Not that there's no atonement, but it's a tzaddik is given to a generation as a specific function the tzaddik has in that generation that's very, very specific and important. But then there's a long-lasting effect related to the teachings. All right. So in Joshua, we have an interesting case because, as we already covered last time, Joshua is a prophet. Most people don't know that outside of the Jewish world. Within the Christian world, Joshua is generally thought of as basically a military commander. That, Moses did all the heavy lifting, and basically all Joshua's job is to not screw things up and to finish the job. He's like the closer that you bring in the ninth inning to finish off the baseball game. That's how people view Joshua. Moses did all the 8 innings of sweat and guts and glory, and here comes Joshua in the ninth inning to mow them down and get you out of the ninth so you can take home the victory. That's how people view Joshua. But that's not what Joshua was. That's selling Joshua quite short. He was a lot more than that. Joshua helped write the Torah. Joshua affected Jewish law. Joshua was a disciple of Moses, and he was a steward of the revelation, and he was a chain in the transmission of Torah and the revelation of Moses to the people. And Joshua has a very important role in that chain of tradition because Joshua presides over a time when the manna ceased. The manna ceased under Joshua. So the circumstances that people lived under Moses is now altered under Joshua. So when the circumstances change, the conditions of engagement with Torah change, which is why we saw last teaching, we saw that some of the amendments that Joshua made to Torah were all related to people's life within the land. You know, it had to do with tithes and offerings and prayer and farming regulations and different things like that, property management, because those were issues that were prevalent when people had actually established a claim in the land. So let's look at another passage in Talmud in relation to that. So the manna ceased under Joshua. Now, if I turn to Yoma, tractate of Talmud called Yoma, and I'm in folio 76A, page 76A, starting in 75B, it says, "But now our soul is dry." This is powerful stuff. "Our soul is dry. There is nothing at all. We have nothing besides this manna to look to." Numbers 11:6. They said, "This manna will eventually swell in our stomachs and kill us. Is there anyone born of a woman who ingests food but does not expel waste?" This supports the Gemara's claim that the manna did not create waste. This actually is a teaching in the Talmud that the people never had to go to the bathroom while they were eating the manna. So when these words were said before Rabbi Yishmael, he said to them, "Do not read it as Abarim, rather read it as Everim, limbs." The manna was something that was absorbed by 248 limbs. "But how do I establish, and you shall have a spade among your weapons?" The spade, of course, if you remember the commandment was to have a spade so that you could bury your poop outside the camp. That's what they're talking about here. And it says, "From the food items that came to them from overseas lands." Rabbi Yishmael disagrees with Rabbi Elazar ben Parada with regard to the effect that manna had on the digestion of other foods. Alternatively, man, Ish, did eat the bread of the mighty. This is quoting Psalm 78:25. The verse is referring to Joshua, for whom manna fell corresponding to all the rest of the Jewish people. When he waited for Moses at Mount Sinai during the 40 days Moses was on the mountain, the verse alludes to this. Man is written here, and man is written there. "Take to you Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom there is spirit, and lay your hand upon him." Numbers 27:18. From here, the Gemara learns that the man is Joshua. The Gemara asks, say that the verse is referring to Moses, about whom it is written, "Now the man Moses was very humble." Numbers 12:3. The Gemara answers, we can learn a verbal analogy to the word man from the word man, but we cannot learn a verbal analogy to the word man from the phrase "the man," which is used to refer to Moses. Furthermore, with regard to the manna, the students of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai asked him, why didn't the manna fall for the Jewish people just once a year to take care of all their needs instead of coming down every day? And he said to them, I will give you a parable. To what does this matter compare? To a king of flesh and blood who has only one son. He granted him an allowance for food once a year, and the son greeted his father only once a year, when it was time for him to receive his allowance. So he arose and granted him his food every day, and his son visited him every day. So too, in the case of the Jewish people, someone who had 4 or 5 children would be worried and say, perhaps the manna will not fall tomorrow, and we will all die of starvation. Consequently, everyone directed their hearts to their Father in heaven every day. The manna that fell each day was sufficient only for that day, so that all the Jewish people would pray to God for food the next day. All right, that's pretty powerful stuff. So what we see now is Moses presided over the people when the manna came every day. But now Joshua presides over the people at a time when the manna ceases. So at the time when the manna ceases is a time when the relationship that the people have with their dependence upon God is now changed. And now there's an expectation that the people are going to take initiative and they're going to walk out what they've learned from their state of dependence. And that's where Joshua comes in. So Joshua comes in when the people are ready to take responsibility to walk out what they've been taught. But in order for us to understand, as I've alluded to already, from a Jewish concept of how Joshua would represent a messianic imperative, and as Kevin was referencing earlier, we have to understand the messianic expectation within Judaism in order for us to contextualize it that way. So I'm going to turn to Ezekiel chapter 39. You can turn there if you want. If you have a Bible with you, you can read with me. When I talk about the Bible with my kids, I call it a Bible. I don't know why. It's just one of those things I do. So we go to chapter 39, beginning in verse 25. I'm going to read verses 25 through 29. So it says, "Therefore thus says the Lord God, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob and have mercy on the whole house of Israel. I will be jealous for my holy name. They will forget their disgrace and all their treachery which they perpetrated against me when they lived securely on their own land with no one to make them afraid. When I bring them back from the peoples and gather them from the lands of their enemies, then I shall be sanctified through them in the sight of the many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God, because I made them go into exile among the nations and then gathered them again to their own land. And I will leave none of them there any longer. I will not hide my face from them any longer, for I will have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the Lord God." You notice some things there. This is a passage which references the messianic hope. Now, among these promises, what of them were fulfilled, quote unquote, by Jesus' ministry? I guess the better question is, were any of them? We have here, I will restore the fortunes of Jacob. They will live securely in their land with no one to make them afraid. I will bring them back from the lands of their enemies, and they will be sanctified. And they will know that I am the Lord, because though I made them to go into exile, I have then gathered them together again. And I will not hide my face anymore, and I will pour my spirit out on them. Other than that last part right there, Christianity cannot make any claims that fulfill that. That's one of the main reasons why Jews have a hard time understanding why they should have to accept Jesus as a Messiah, when what did he do that makes us confident that he is one? See, Joshua is a true messianic figure because Joshua actually leads the people to victory. Christians have a hope of victory, but it hasn't been realized yet. So sure, Jesus may come down in the clouds and he may finish that job, and that's what Christians are hoping for. But what I always try to point out to people is that you want to believe that, that's fine, but you have to understand that from a Jewish perspective, the deed has not been done yet. So a Jew is waiting for the same thing that a Christian is. But Christians don't see it that way. They think the Jews are blind and that they don't even recognize their hope, and the Christians have all this confidence that they have their hope secure, when in fact their hope is the same thing the Jewish people are hoping for. They're hoping for a future redemption. So when the Jews talk about the coming of a Mashiach, they're talking about this in Ezekiel. This is the vision. It's the vision of a messianic redemption. When Christians talk about messianic redemption, they talk about getting their sins forgiven. A whole different ballgame, whole different concept. What it is ultimately, in most Christians' ideas, if they don't have a Jewish conception, it's human sacrifice for the forgiveness of my sins, which a Jew would be like, no, that's not Judaism. That's something else. I was teasing people a couple weeks ago, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but kind of true at the same time, that I have to laugh. I see all these I see all these people that are constantly, every Passover season, people put pictures out on Facebook of a lamb saying that Jesus is our Passover sacrifice. Well, if that's true, if you study the Passover, if it's true that Jesus is our Passover lamb, Passover sacrifice, if he's representative, not so much the Passover, but if you look at Yom Kippur, right, where you have the two goats, this was the example I was trying to make. If you look at the two goats of Yom Kippur, where do the sins go? The sins go to what the Christian church has termed the scapegoat. That's a King James term that doesn't exist in ancient history. The actual term is the goat to Azazel, to the demon. The sins go to the demon. so if we're going to say that Jesus fulfills Yom Kippur, you're basically saying that Satan is your savior because he's the one that takes your sin. I mean, people don't think about this stuff. They just throw these ideas around because some pastor teaches it to them. And the pastor himself doesn't even think about this stuff. He doesn't even realize what he's saying. Anyways, moving on, back to Joshua. So we read this. I'm not trying to be really negative here on Christians. I'm just trying to say that a lot of the Messianic movement, and now I'm using the term Messianic in the terms that I was accused of, a lot of the Messianic Jewish movement thinks it's teaching and learning Judaism, when really they're learning a Christian veneer over Jewish concepts. Because when you really start to learn Judaism authentically, what happens is a crisis. If you're intelligent and you're paying attention, if you study authentic Jewish sources, what you find is you find yourself having a crisis of theology. Because you suddenly realize that Judaism is a self-contained system that doesn't need this God-man who sacrifices himself inserted into it to complete it. Doesn't need that. It's already got a complete spiritual system on its own merits. So if that's true, what you end up asking yourself is, so what's the point of Jesus again? It's a real question. That's a good question. Okay, if you're going to learn Judaism, you have to ask that question. Where does Jesus fit in this? Well, you have two choices. You can abandon him altogether, or you can try your best to try to figure out what is the Jewish understanding of atonement, and then work backwards from there and reverse engineer the whole process so you can get back to a place where, okay, so what would have been the concept of the first century? And where would this have fit? And when you recognize that, okay, well, what the church is teaching today has no connection whatsoever to what that picture looks like, you realize that Christianity has become a false religion. It may have originally started as a sect of Judaism, but what it became is something far different than Judaism. And if you try to fit that pagan system of thought back into an authentic Jewish model, what you have to do is you have to twist the Jewish ideas out of shape beyond recognition in order to fit them in. This is why I said last time I taught that one of the biggest problems we have in the Messianic Jewish movement, and I say we, I'm not part of that movement anymore, so I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying we as though I'm associated with it, because I am not. But for those who are part of it, we need to understand that we can't take the teachings of ancient rabbis who had no connection whatsoever to Christian thought, and because there's some overlapping spiritual principles that are at play in the teaching that we're looking at, automatically think, oh, this fits. This is what Jesus was saying. No, it isn't. Okay? You don't know what Jesus was saying. You need to study Torah for like 15, 20 years under authentic rabbis probably before. I don't even qualify under that. I'm probably 10 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe I'll be qualified to be able to connect those dots. But people are out there connecting dots, and they don't even know what the dots are that they're connecting. They don't even know how they fit in the spiritual universe. This is why I did the Ramchal, because the Ramchal is a systematic, structured system of learning essential concepts. It unravels from the get-go the basic problematic concepts that people bring to the table when they start trying to learn Torah. What's that number one concept? The biggest one is the unity and the oneness of God. Most Messianic congregations I would say 90% still believe in the Trinity and still believe in a divine Messiah. Right off Jump Street, they are completely antithetical to authentic Torah. They're not learning Torah. They're trying to put a idolatrous concept and insert it into Torah. Doesn't work. It'll never work. It'll never fly. And you'll have Messianic rabbis that'll argue until the cows come home. Oh, yeah, you know, like one of the more popular ones right now is FFOZ is out there teaching that the Adam Kadmon is a primordial representation of Jesus, which is absolute bunk. The Adam Kadmon is a world. It's an existence. It's not a person. Okay. There's a lot of stuff like that. We have to be very careful. I'm not telling you to give up your faith in Jesus if you have that. I'm telling you to hold your horses and don't be so quick to make parallels with him just because you've read a few sources in the Jewish world. Because you got to understand, those rabbis you're reading would balk immensely. When I say balk, I mean B-A-L-K. They would protest your attempt to make connections to their teachings and the teachings of the New Testament. They would protest vehemently that action. They would not want to be associated with that. And you have to ask the question, why? Why would they protest that? Is it just a cultural reality? Are they trying to disassociate? No, I'm talking about these ancient rabbis that are dead. You know, do you think Rambam wants to be connected to Paul? No, hardly. So we have no right to make that connection in good conscience unless we really know what we're talking about and we can cite it and back it up with sources. If you were to write a paper, like my son-in-law wrote a paper, right? You guys know about it. My son-in-law wrote this paper on the book of Colossians. He started writing it maybe 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I read the very first draft. I was the first person to see it. I think he sent it to me and 1 or 2 other people. And I read it, and at that time, he was mainly looking for writing help. I offered him some help on how to write a collegiate paper. I gave him some form suggestions, some editorial suggestions on his writing, his style, his sentence structure, stuff like that. A little bit of feedback on his argumentation, but not much. I mostly helped him with writing. Gave him my opinion on his argument, gave him some encouragement, and he kind of took off from there. And what he went through was a rigmarole. I mean, my son-in-law had to go through a tremendous process where he started out, you know, I was his expert. I was the resident expert. I'd written college papers, so I was able to give him some direction. He quickly went on from me to Keegan Chandler, who has written books, you know, so Keegan helped him a lot with that, a lot more than I could help him. And then he went on from there, and today Brian is far more advanced than I am in terms of structuring a paper correctly, because he had to go through all the chops. He had to go through all the different things that are required of somebody to write a collegiate, not even a collegiate, it was beyond collegiate. Brian's paper is PhD level. I mean, he's now citable in the academic world. So it was a process. I mean, you're talking 2.5 to 3 years for one paper on 2 verses. And I'm using this as an illustration that people just flippantly throw things around on Facebook, like, you know, look at this passage. What a great connection. And everyone's like, oh yeah, you know, 50 likes. This is awesome. And there's no vetting. There's no scholarly perspective on it. There's no think tank of vetted scholars who are engaging with the idea. It's just conversation. You'll find very few actual scholars that engage in Facebook. Very few do. And if they do, they only engage with other scholars. And there's a reason for that. I mean, if I message Rabbi Sachs, you know, he might say, hey, thanks, Dave, for the message, but he's not going to engage in a theological conversation with me. This is Rabbi Sachs. I mean, why would he talk to me? Who am I? You know what I'm saying? So we got to know where we're at. You know, we come in and we think, oh, we're excited about Torah. You know, I'm going to learn Torah, and you know, I'm going to make all these connections. We're gonna make the church see. You know, Torah connects with all. And you got rabbis and yeshivas that have been teaching for 50 years, and they're looking at this and they're like, They're not even paying attention to it. It's not even on their radar. You know, when you get into Jewish spirituality and Jewish teachings, the level of depth and veracity and vibrancy of the teachings and the layers of thought and the centuries of tradition that go into that, you know, some newbie messianic comes at these people and says, oh, I don't agree with them, you know, because Jesus said this and Jesus said that. I mean, you're not even on the radar. You don't even register a blip on their radar screen. You're like a fly that gets swatted by a windshield wiper and they're going 80 miles an hour down the highway. They don't even see it. We don't understand. We think we're relevant. We think we matter in our opinion. The Messianic Jewish world doesn't matter to the Jewish world. They don't care what we think. Again, I say we. I'm not among them anymore. They don't care what the Messianic Jewish world thinks. They really don't. The only thing they care about is don't try to talk to our congregants about Jesus. That's what they care about. Beyond that, they don't care what they think. Anyways, my son-in-law recently had correspondence with First Fruits of Zion. I won't say who. And Brian told me, he said, I thought it was interesting because he said, I cited them in my paper. And I got correspondence with one of them and said, please don't do that. Please don't cite us in your future work. You're only hurting yourself. We have no credibility in the scholarly world. And I went, and him and I were laughing like, this is hilarious. They are so defensive of their teachings as being so vetted and authoritative to the Christian world. But in the actual world of scholarship, they have zero credibility whatsoever. So you just got to know where you're learning and what you're learning and why you're learning it. I guess that's my point, is this is your life and this is your educational process. Don't let a political organization, and that includes the Jewish world, don't let a political organization or a political position determine how you learn. You have the freedom as a human being made in the image of God to seek out knowledge. And truth and knowledge can be found in many places. But if you're going to learn Judaism, you need to learn it from authentic sources. I'm teaching you Hashkafa, Musar, and I'm exposing you to authentic sources. My goal with this teaching series is to eventually hand you off like a relay race where you'll still engage with me, because if you like the way I teach and you like my style and you engage with the way I think it's awesome and I appreciate it. But my success as a teacher is getting you to the place where you can engage with somebody better than me. That's my success. I'm successful when you can graduate from me and go to somebody better eventually. Not that you would leave me behind. I'd cry. I'd be very sad. But to go on and to continue your education and to go to the levels that you can handle and that you want. See, that's proper education. You know, if somebody's teaching at a professor position at a college and you're in a bachelor's program, you know, your goal is to pass the course so you can get a bachelor's degree so you can eventually go on to get a master's. You know, no professor that's teaching you how to get a bachelor's is going to be offended if you transfer to an upper echelon college to get your master's. They're not going to be like, oh, you left me behind. You know, I was the one that gave you your start and you abandoned me and you went to Yale. I feel so betrayed. No, it's like, they're like, yay, you made it. You made it to your goal. You got to where you wanted to go. You achieved what you were hoping for. You made it to Yale. You're going to achieve your goals. Like, hurrah, I'm so happy I was part of it. And that's how I feel. I'm not trying to cloister you guys into my little yeshiva group from Buford, Georgia. I'm trying to pass you on to greater things. I'm trying to lead you guys to the source so that you also can experience the full manifestation of your potential. That's the whole goal. If I'm not accomplishing that, what am I doing? I'm a cistern. I'm not flowing water. I'm not Mayim Chayim. I'm just a pond collecting mosquitoes. I don't want that. I want you guys to flow through. I mean, to me, it's obvious. So we understand this messianic picture of Joshua in the Jewish sense of the word messianic. Let's go to chapter 2. We'll speed up here a little bit. According to the Vilna Gaon, the spies were dispatched immediately at the end of the mourning period for Moses. So we have the spies incident in chapter 2 of Joshua. So the mourning period for a great leader is 30 days, a month. So at the end of 30 days, the spies are sent. Why 30 days? Why are they waiting? We'll explain that in a minute. According to Rashi and other sources, the two spies that were sent were Phinehas and Caleb. You remember Phinehas? Excuse me, I just burped. I can't believe that. Phinehas was the, I apologize for that. Phinehas was the priest who was zealous for the sin in the camp, and he slayed the two people that were committing sin in the midst of the camp, and he stopped the plague, right? So God made a covenant of peace with Phinehas because of his zealousness. So Phinehas and also Caleb. Remember, Caleb was one of the spies who came back from Moses sending out the 12 spies. Caleb was one of the two spies, along with Joshua, who gave a positive report on the land. And Caleb actually rebuked the negative report because he knew it was discouraging the people. So Phinehas and Caleb now have the honor of going in and spying on Jericho. The Midrash states that the spies disguised themselves as potters or carpenters, and they went through Jericho hawking their wares. And this is how they came into the city. They came in with a bunch of clay pots, and they pretended to be, selling them and trying to sell them. So it was a very normal activity. Nothing to raise suspicion. The Malbim, who is a famous sage, the Malbim teaches us that the purpose for Joshua sending the spies, this is key. And the reason he hid it from the nation, understand that Joshua did not announce to the nation as a whole that he was sending spies in ahead. And the question is why? Why would he hide this from the people? Was he afraid of the report that he would get? Was Joshua doubting God's promise? Because God promised victory, right? So God promised victory. We deal with this a lot of times, right? So a lot of people that have faith, especially in the charismatic movement of Christianity, people see diligence and strategy as an example of a lack of faith. If you go to a business planner and you strategize your business, you're somehow showing a lack of faith, because you're not just trusting everything in God. Or if you get some vision of something you want to do for God, and you actually go consult counselors about is this feasible? Do I have enough money? Do I have enough this? Do I have enough of that? Oh no, you're just going to trust by faith. It's like if you trust by faith, God promised you the vision, you're just going to step in it. Well, just because God gave you a vision doesn't mean you just step into it any old time you feel like it. That's a good recipe to get wiped out. So Joshua sends spies in. Question is why? Why does he send in spies? Well, the Midrash, the Malbim specifically tells us that it wasn't to determine their strategic battle strategy. He didn't send the spies in order to do what you think a spy would do. He wasn't checking out the embattlements. He wasn't checking the fortified soldiers. He wasn't checking the armaments. He wasn't checking, the positionings of the wall to see where the weak points are. That's not what the spies were doing. The spies are doing something very specific. They were checking on the psychological makeup of the city. That's what the Midrash says. The psychological makeup of the defenders. Where were they at mentally? Where are they at in their psyche? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What's going on? What's the vibe? What's the word on the street? That's what they wanted to know. Proverbs 21:22 says, a wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the stronghold in which they trust. Okay, so what is the strength of a people? It's their morale. Once the spirit of a people is gone, it doesn't matter what they have for weapons. You can overcome them. If your why is bigger than their why, they've already lost. They can't stand before you. Wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the stronghold in which they trust. So, interestingly, the spies in the first verse of Joshua chapter 2, they come to the house of a harlot named Rahab, which brings me back to the Talmud. I want to read something to you from Megillah. So, in the tractate Megillah, 14b, we see this. It says, the Bereta indicates that Huldah was in fact a descendant of Rahab, and seemingly not of Joshua. 8 prophets, who were also priests, descended from Rahab, the prostitute. And they are Neriah, his son Baruch, Sariah, Maaseiah, Jeremiah, his father Hilkiah, Jeremiah's cousin Hanamel, and Hanamel's father Shallum. Interesting. For Rahab, here's the future of what happens with Rahab. Rahab converted to Judaism, and she married Joshua, what they tell us. Therefore, Huldah descended from both Joshua and Rahab. So Rahab ultimately marries Joshua. Isn't that interesting? Joshua was an old man at this time. The Midrash says that at this point, Rahab was approximately in her early 40s. And she had been practicing harlotry for over, she was in her 60s, and she had been practicing harlotry for over 40 years. Very, very interesting. Okay. So they came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and they lay there. Joshua 2:1. Rahab, originating from an immoral, sinful nation, and being one of the lowest of that nation, nevertheless repented and became an honored member of that holy nation. This is a beautiful and important picture that we have to emphasize here in the book of Joshua. That's a quote from Judaica Press. I'll read it again. It says, Rahab, who originates from an immoral and sinful nation, and more than that, she is one of its lowest citizens in status, nevertheless repented and became an honored member of the holy nation of God. And isn't it interesting, as a key point here for us to dwell upon, that as Israel is preparing to enter the promised land, they encounter a lowly, repentant sinner who becomes one of them. This is a precursor and a sign of what it should mean to the nations when Israel is in sovereign control of the Holy Land, and what it means to Israel when God establishes their nation. What Israel should expect to encounter is lowly, desperate, repentant people who want to join her. In other words, part of the messianic process is that the lowly of the nations will seek to join themselves to the Jewish people. In Joshua 2, verse 4, it says, the woman had taken the 2 men and had hidden them. And this is where we get into some of these midrashic overlays that I was mentioning at the beginning of the class. So we already established that it was Phinehas and Caleb. So it says in Midrash Tanchuma that Caleb and Phinehas stood before them, yet the men who came to look for them did not see them, because Phinehas was like an angel. The Midrash goes on to explain that priests and prophets are compared to angels. The holiest and most righteous of them, having cleaved to the Almighty with devakut, with attachment, their spiritual able to overpower their physical, giving them the power to render themselves invisible. So the Midrash teaches then that Phinehas literally rendered himself invisible to the men seeking them by the power of his spirituality. Phinehas is literally referred to as an angel in Judges chapter 3. He was also a priest, as we already know, which Malachi compares to an angel of the Lord. Compare this now to John 8, verse 59, where it's written that, therefore, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. The same verbiage that we find related to Phinehas. Phinehas hid himself, meaning he rendered himself invisible to the eyes of those seeking him. It's a midrashic way of explaining the power of a very, very holy person. The ability to become invisible to less holy individuals. Very interesting. When you put these stories into their Jewish context, how we see a different picture of what we've been taught before. Because in the church, such verses are commonplace and explained easily as evidence of the fact that Jesus is divine. And since he's divine, he can manipulate natural forces. But what we see in reality is that midrashically, from a Jewish viewpoint, this is a legend that has been attributed to others in Israel's past. Therefore, it's much more probable that this is something that was used as a mechanism or a vehicle, if you will, to try to explain who they thought this guy was and how to understand his work and his ministry. Not that it was necessarily a literal thing. And if it was literal, it was something that was very common to others who had come before him. Not that he was divine or that he was, perish the thought, God himself. Which I still cannot understand how people that are otherwise intelligent can believe that, but they do. The idea that a human being can be God is just like, I was told a few months ago, well, you have a very low view of Christology. I said, no, you have a very low view of God. Sorry, it's not my Christology that's the problem. I said, you have a very truncated pagan view of God. That's the only reason why you can think stuff like that, not because of the way I view the Zodic. Anyways, so the rabbis teach that the identity of the spies is hidden in the scriptures because of the disgrace of entering the house of the harlot. But the rabbis reveal it because of the ultimate fate of righteous Rahab. Do you follow that? So in other words, the rabbis were not going to reveal the identity of the spies. Why? Because it's shameful to go into the house of a harlot. But because of Rahab's eventual destiny and where she goes with her faith, it becomes a source of bragging rights rather than a source of shame. And this is an important lesson for us. We might find ourselves dealing with things that we're not proud of from our past. But we're not defined by our past. We're defined by our future and where we're going with God. And this sounds trite. Many people have said this. But truly, your destiny in God is far more relevant to your identity than anything that's gone on in the past. Because anything that happened in our past that we're not proud of eventually becomes a bragging right of transformation once we overcome it. And as long as we press on in God, we will overcome it, whatever it is. And it's no longer a source of shame, and it no longer needs to be concealed and hidden in shame. It can be brought forth as an offering of worship. So Phinehas and Caleb wouldn't have been talked about by name in the Midrash if Rahab had not repented and turned and converted. But because of what she does and because of her important role in assisting the Jews, she's celebrated. And therefore the rabbis are confident to include Phinehas and Caleb in the story. So our choices make a difference. Our choices impact even the testimony and results of the lives of others. It's never a waste of time to pursue God, is the point. Never a waste of time. Rahab says to them in verse 9 of chapter 2, that I know the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away because of you. Some of the sages claim that Rahab converted to Judaism at this time with these men. Conversion was a little simpler back then. Rashi says on this that there did not remain even the spirit in the city to lie with a woman at this time. Such was the fear of the people. There was neither prince nor ruler, Rashi says, who had not had relations with Rahab the harlot in Jericho. Okay, I correct myself on what I said earlier. I had the timeline wrong. Rashi says she was 10 years old. Oh, no, I was right. She was 10 years old when the Israelites departed from Egypt, and she practiced harlotry for 40 years. 40 years. She was not a 25-year-old chick when this happened. But in this passage, significantly, Rahab expresses in really truly amazing fashion her monotheistic convictions. The Midrash says this. It says, God says to her, your acceptance of my existence is understandable. But why did you accept my existence in heaven, which you cannot see? For your great faith, your descendant Ezekiel. So Ezekiel, the prophet who I read from earlier, is a descendant of Rahab. The Midrash says, for your great faith, your descendant Ezekiel will see what other prophets have not seen. Another point of contact where we see that the Midrash appears to have been lifted from Jewish history and applied within John's gospel, where it says in John 20:28, Jesus said to them, because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who do not see and yet believe. I guarantee you, if you asked 100 Christians, not one of them would know that that verse is directly lifted from a midrash about Joshua and about Rahab. Joshua 2 verses 13 says, you shall deliver our lives from death. This is the promise. So she's negotiating with the spies saying that you're going to come back. I'm going to explain this in a second, but remember that salvation is rescue. What Rahab is crying out for is salvation. She doesn't want to die, and she doesn't want her family to die. She wants to be rescued. She wants to be saved. That's what salvation is. It's not getting your sins forgiven. Contrary to Christian thought, salvation is being rescued from disaster. So the Malbim, second time we quote him, the Malbim, great sage of Israel, says, by saying this, by saying you shall deliver our lives from death in Joshua 2:13, the sages teach that what Rahab meant is you will save us from a spiritual death by accepting us as proselytes. You will save us from a spiritual death by accepting us as proselytes and accepting us in our attempt to attach to you. Joshua 2:15 says, and she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was in the town wall. Think about that. She let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was in the town wall. What is she letting down? She's letting down the spies from being captured and brought to the authorities so that they could complete their mission. Consider this parallel. 2 Corinthians 11:33. And I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall, and so escaped his hands. Is it also possible that the Rahab account is even being lifted by Paul to connect him to messianic expectation in his teachings? After all, consider the Midrash on Rahab. By this very rope and window, the sinners would ascend to her. O Lord of the universe, with these I have sinned, with these forgive me. That's the Midrash on Rahab. Paul, in like manner, relegates himself as a chief of sinners among men in 1 Timothy 1:15. And he's let down through a window in the wall to escape those who pursue him, who seek his life. Very, very interesting to me. Joshua 2:19 says, it shall be that whoever shall be with you in the house, his blood shall be upon our head, if any hand be upon him. Rashi says he shall be considered suicide since he risked his life unnecessarily. Now think about this. Joshua 2:19. It shall be that whatsoever shall be with you in the house, whosoever shall be with you in the house, his blood shall be upon our head, spoken by the Jewish spies, his blood shall be upon our head. Matthew 27:25, and all the people said, his blood shall be upon us and our children. I searched out a number of Christian commentaries on this verse. Not one of them chose to deal with verse 19 of Joshua 2. One of the most anti-Semitic statements in the entire New Testament is the claim that the people en masse, as Pilate, this bloodthirsty murderer Pilate, is looking at the crowd and saying, shall I release this innocent man to you? And they say, crucify him. His blood be upon us and our descendants. Many rabbis have read that verse and said there is no way in God's universe that that is written by a Jew. Unbelievable, as we read in the story of Joshua and Rahab, that these spies say the exact same words, inverted. If we don't deliver you, the blood will be upon our heads. It's a reversal. And not any Christian commentary I dealt with addressed it. It's an obvious, literal parallel. The Christian commentaries don't deal with it. It's embarrassing to them. They can't deal with it. What we have is an anti-Semitic reversal of theme that takes a positive Jewish event that builds pride in the Jewish people and turns it into a source of eternal shame, embarrassment, and persecution. Get on to chapter 3 of Joshua. If somebody can find a Christian commentary that does deal with it, I'd love to see it. I haven't found one. And they lodged before they crossed over, Joshua 3:1. They lodged before they crossed over. We're going to finish with this. So this is interesting. So why? Why would Joshua lead the people up to the banks of the Jordan, and then he would stop? Why would he stop and set up camp? I mean, why would you give your enemy a chance to survey the size of your army and fortify themselves? I mean, that seems to be what he's doing. He's like laying himself out before the river in the plain so that the Jericho can see, okay, here's the size of the army. Here's where they are. This is the direction they're coming from. Let's prepare ourselves. I mean, he's like giving opportunity. He's tipping off their position, tipping off their strength. So why does he do it? Gersonides and the Malbim, two sages of Israel, both say that the miracle of the splitting of the Jordan needed to be witnessed by both Israel and the Canaanites. So God desired that both Israel as a nation and Jericho as a city, state, would both witness the miracle that was about to transpire. So the command for preparation could not have been given during the mourning period for Moses. I mentioned earlier that there was a 30-day mourning period for Moses. Why? Well, the sages teach that the divine presence does not rest upon a prophet during a period of grief and sadness. Last Talmud reading I'm going to give you is Talmud Barakot 30b. Barakot 30b says, similarly, I commended mirth. That is the joy of a mitzvah. And of mirth, what does it accomplish? That is joy. That is not the joy of a mitzvah. The praise of joy mentioned here is to teach you that divine presence rests upon an individual, neither from an atmosphere of sadness, nor from an atmosphere of laziness, nor from an atmosphere of laughter, nor from an atmosphere of frivolity, nor from an atmosphere of idle conversation, nor from an atmosphere of idle chatter, but rather from an atmosphere imbued with the joy of a mitzvah. As it was stated with regard to Elisha, that after he became angry at the king of Israel, his prophetic spirit left him until he requested, but now bring me a minstrel. And it came to pass that when the minstrel played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. 2 Kings 3:15. But Yehuda said, and so too one should be joyful before stating a matter of halakha. Rava said, and so too one should be joyful before going to sleep in order to have a good dream. The Gemara asks, is that so? That one should introduce matters of halakha joyfully? Didn't Rav Gadel say that Rav said, any Torah scholar who sits before his teacher and his lips are not dripping with myrrh due to fear of his teacher, those lips shall be burnt. As it is stated, his lips are as lilies, dripping with flowing myrrh. Song of Songs 5:13. He interpreted homiletically, do not read moreover, flowing myrrh, rather read mar over, flowing bitterness. Likewise, do not read shoshanim, lilies, rather read sheshanim, that are studying, meaning that lips that are studying Torah must be full of bitterness. The Gemara explains this is not difficult. There is no contradiction here, as this, where it was taught that one should introduce matters of halakha joyfully, is referring to a rabbi, and that where it was taught that one must be filled with bitterness is referring to a student who must listen to his teacher with trepidation. If you wish, say instead that this and that are referring to a rabbi, and it is not difficult. This, where it was taught that he must be joyful, is before he begins teaching. Whereas that, where it was taught that he must be filled with bitterness and trepidation, is after he already began teaching halakha. That explanation is like what was that which Rabbah did. Before he began teaching halakha to the sages, he would say something humorous, and the sages would be cheered. Ultimately, he sat in trepidation and began teaching the halakha. So it says in the halakha itself that the joy of a mitzvah, what does this mean? The Rambam wrote, the joy of performing mitzvot is a great service, and there is no greatness and honor other than being joyful before God, as it is stated, King David leaping and dancing before God, 2 Samuel 6:16. And the divine presence does rest upon an individual neither from an atmosphere of sadness, but rather from an atmosphere imbued with the joy of a mitzvah. None of the prophets could prophesy at will, the halakha states. Rather, they would meditate in solitude, focus their thoughts, and fill their hearts with joy. By the same token, the prophetic spirit does not rest upon one who is sad or lazy, but only upon one filled with joy. Therefore, the novice prophets would play the drums, lyre, flute, and harps, while the prophets sought to prophesy. This is from Rambam, Sefer Hamada, Hilkot Yesodi HaTorah 7:4. All right. So therefore, Joshua waits. He honors the mourning period of Moses, and he waits for direction. And at the end of the mourning period, he sends the spies, not to lay out the lay of the land and the military strength of the city, because God already promised victory. That wasn't what he was sending the spies for. He sent the spies to determine the psychological, emotional strength of the people. What was their state? Where are they at? When Jacob heard that Joseph was still alive, this is an example of the joy that's necessary for a prophet. When Jacob heard that Joseph was still alive, his spirit revived. The Targum paraphrases this to mean that his spirit of prophecy revived. In other words, Jacob couldn't prophesy while he was grieving the loss of his son. But when he heard of his son's continued existence, the fact that he was alive, he revived and he was able to prophesy again. So there's a key here for us, practically. We have problems we want to overcome. We have things we need to work on, we need to fix. We have to understand that there must be rest and preparation before our activity. And we have to find joy before we can experience conquest. So if we're struggling and we're hurting and we're waiting and we're trying to discern, if we're in a place of anxiety, a place of stress, a place of disturbance, we have to wait. We have to wait on God. Because when the joy is revived, the spirit of prophecy will come with it. The guidance, the light, the direction. In Joshua 3:2, it states, after 3 days, one does not need to think too hard to see an obvious parallel between the mourning of the disciples following the crucifixion with the sudden and unexpected joy and confidence of victory experienced after the resurrection is reported to them. We see that. Again, we can look at that two different ways. We can say, well, this just goes to prove. Or we can say that this is a result of an overlay to prove something. Either way, the key and the musar and the principle exists. We shouldn't make permanent decisions in a state of grief. This is an important lesson. I've failed in this lesson many times. So I'm not speaking from a place of victory here. I still seek victory in this area. But we do a lot of damage many times to relationships and to opportunities when we react in a place of grief and pain. Trust me, as one who knows this pain, it's better to wait in the Lord and to seek perspective and to be in a place of calm and serene state of your spirit, to seek joy where it can be found, for the time of grief to be over before we seek direction. That's an important lesson for us to learn. So I'm going to conclude there. I've gone plenty long. And next week we're going to see some more exciting stuff. We're going to see Joshua walking on water. It's going to be pretty cool, and other things as well. So that concludes the class for tonight. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we can continue with a few minutes of chat after the meeting.